I never thought my property rights would destroy an entire town's economy, but watching the news coverage of Fairbanks business owners protesting outside City Hall, I realized just how far things had spiraled. My name is Patrick Barnes, and I own 300 acres of pristine Alaskan wilderness about 20 miles outside Fairbanks. The land has been in my family since the 1960s, when my grandfather bought it for practically nothing. Back then, Alaska was still figuring itself out as a state, and land was cheap if you were willing to brave the cold and isolation. My grandfather built a small cabin there, and over the decades, my father expanded it into a proper lodge. When Dad passed 5 years ago, he left it all to me. The property is special for one major reason. It sits right between the Chena River State Recreation Area and a massive stretch of public land managed by the Bureau of Land Management. For snowmobile enthusiasts, my land is the gateway to over 500 miles of interconnected trails that wind through some of the most beautiful winter wilderness in Alaska. Without access through my property, reaching those trails means driving an extra 100 miles around to the next access point, which makes it essentially useless for day trips and severely limits the attractiveness of the area for tourism. I have always been generous with access. My father was too. We loved snowmobiling ourselves, and we understood the culture. Every winter, hundreds of tourists would come through, paying for guided tours, renting equipment in Fairbanks, staying in local hotels, eating at restaurants. The economic impact was substantial. Several businesses in town existed almost entirely because of the winter snowmobile tourism my property access enabled. I never charged anyone to cross my land. There was an informal system where tour operators would stop by the lodge, check in with me, and I would give them a quick weather and trail update. It worked perfectly for years. I made my living working remotely as a software consultant, so I did not need the tourism money. I just enjoyed being part of the community and seeing people experience the wilderness I loved. Then the HOA happened. About 2 years ago, a development company bought up parcels of land about 5 miles from my property line. They built Snow Peak Estates, a gated community of upscale homes marketed to wealthy retirees and remote workers looking for the Alaska experience without actually roughing it. The homes were nice, I will admit that. Modern construction, great insulation, all the amenities you could want. They sold quickly, mostly to people from California, Washington, and Oregon. The Snow Peak Estates Homeowners Association formed immediately, as HOAs do, and they wasted no time making their presence known. Within 6 months, they were sending letters to neighboring property owners about everything from tree height to the color of outbuildings. I ignored the first few letters I received because I was not part of their HOA and my property was not subject to their rules. My lawyer confirmed this when I asked him about it. The HOA president was a woman named Susan Carmichael, and she fit every stereotype you can imagine. Mid-50s, blonde bob haircut that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, and an attitude that suggested she had spent her entire life getting her way through sheer persistence and volume. She had moved to Alaska from San Diego 6 months prior, and apparently decided that Alaska needed to be more like California. The first time I met Susan in person was on a cold January morning when she showed up at my lodge unannounced. I was having coffee and watching a herd of moose in the distance when I heard a luxury SUV pull up outside. "Patrick Barnes," she called out, knocking on my door with that particular aggressive rap that certain people use when they think they are important. I opened the door, letting in a blast of cold air. "That's me. Can I help you?" I'm Susan Carmichael, president of the Snow Peak Estates HOA. We need to talk about the noise problem. I blinked. Noise problem, the snowmobiles, she said, as if it should have been obvious. They're constantly running through the area, and the noise is disturbing our residents. Some of our homeowners paid over $1 million for peace and quiet, and instead they're hearing engines all day long. The trails don't go through your development, I said slowly. They're on my property and public land. The nearest point is probably 3 miles from the closest house in Snow Peak. Noise carries, Susan said sharply, especially in cold air. It's a documented phenomenon. We've had multiple complaints. I took a sip of my coffee, already tired of this conversation. I'm sorry your residents are bothered, but people have been using these trails for decades. I'm not going to shut them down because someone decided to build houses near recreational land and is now surprised that recreation is happening. Susan's face tightened. You're not understanding the situation. We represent a significant property value investment in this area. We have rights. So do I replied. And so do the people who use public lands for legal recreation. Now, if you will excuse me, my coffee is getting cold. I started to close the door, but Susan put her hand against it. This isn't over, Mr. Barnes. We will be taking action. You do what you need to do, I said, and shut the door. That was my first mistake. I should have taken her more seriously. Over the next few weeks, I started hearing from tour operators about drones flying over the trails. The drones belong to the HOA, apparently documenting snowmobile activity. Then Susan started filing complaints with every government agency she could find, from the Alaska Department of Natural Resources to the Environmental Protection Agency, claiming that snowmobile traffic through my property was causing environmental damage, noise pollution, and even claiming we were disturbing wildlife migration patterns. Every complaint was investigated and dismissed. My property access was legal, the trails were established and maintained, and environmental studies had been done years ago showing minimal impact. But each investigation took time and created hassle. Then Susan got creative. One morning in late February, I found surveyors on my property near the main trail access point. I drove my snowmobile down to confront them. "What's going on here?" I demanded. The head surveyor, an older guy who looked uncomfortable, showed me paperwork. "We're surveying for the Snow Peak Estates HOA. They've claimed there's a boundary dispute and hired us to establish the actual property lines." I pulled out my phone and called my lawyer, Jerry Morrison. After a quick conversation and some exchanged photos of the survey documents, Jerry told me to let them finish, but to document everything. It turned out the HOA was claiming that the main access trail through my property actually crossed a tiny corner of land they said belonged to Snow Peak Estates. Their claim was based on an obscure interpretation of an old property description from the 1970s. It was nonsense, but it was expensive nonsense to fight. "They're trying to bleed you with legal fees," Jerry explained when I met with him in Fairbanks that afternoon. "Even though their claim is baseless, you'll have to pay me to fight it, and they know that. It's a common HOA tactic." "How much are we talking?" I asked. "Depends on how far they push it. Could be 10,000, could be 50. They have HOA dues funding their legal expenses, so they can afford to be stubborn." I sat back in Jerry's office chair, frustrated. This is insane. What do they actually want, my guess? They want you to shut down the trail access entirely. If they can make it expensive and annoying enough, they think you will just give up. "I'm not giving up," I said. Jerry nodded. "I know, but you need to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better." He was right. In March, The HOA filed an injunction seeking to block snowmobile access through my property pending resolution of the boundary dispute. The hearing was scheduled for early April, which meant the current snowmobile season would be over anyway, but it was clearly a shot across the bow for next winter. The local business community was starting to take notice. I received calls from tour operators, hotel owners, and restaurant managers, all asking what was happening. I explained the situation as best I could, and they were supportive but worried. "If we lose this access, we lose half our winter business," explained Marcus Jennings, who owned Fairbanks Arctic Tours, the largest snowmobile tour operation in the area. "We've been using these trails for 20 years. I'm not planning to lose," I assured him. The April hearing was a disaster, though not because of the judge. The HOA's lawyer presented their boundary dispute claim, and Jerry systematically destroyed it with historical property records, survey maps, and expert testimony. The judge was clearly annoyed that his time was being wasted and denied the injunction. But standing outside the courthouse afterward, Susan approached me with a smile that made my skin crawl. "Enjoy your victory," she said sweetly. "We have plenty of other options." "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked. She just walked away. I found out what she meant 2 weeks later when I received a citation from the Alaska State Troopers. The HOA had filed a complaint alleging that I was operating a commercial enterprise on my property without proper permits and licensing. They claimed that because tour operators crossed my land, I was essentially running an unlicensed tour business. This was absurd on multiple levels. I did not charge anyone to cross my property. I was not guiding tours. I was not providing services. I was simply allowing access, which was my right as a property owner. But again, it required time and money to fight. I had to hire Jerry again, gather documentation, and go through the administrative process of responding to the complaint. The state eventually dismissed it, but not before I spent another $5,000 in legal fees. By this point, I was getting angry. Not just frustrated, genuinely angry. Susan and her HOA were costing me money and time, all because they had decided that their desire for perfect silence trumped decades of established use and the economic well-being of an entire community. In June, I got a call from Jerry with news that made my blood boil. "They've filed a nuisance lawsuit," he said. "They're claiming that allowing snowmobile access through your property creates a public nuisance that damages property values in Snow Peak Estates." "Can they do that?" I asked. "They can file anything they want. Winning is another matter." "But Patrick, this is going to be expensive to defend. We're talking about a full civil trial, depositions, expert witnesses. You could be looking at $100,000 in legal fees, maybe more." I sat in silence for a long moment, staring out at the summer landscape. How much would it cost them? They're funding it through HOA dues and a special assessment. They've got about 200 homeowners paying in. For them, it's distributed cost. For you, it's all on your shoulders. That night, I barely slept. I kept running numbers in my head. I had savings, but not unlimited savings. I could sell my consulting business, maybe take out a loan against the property. But even if I won the lawsuit, which Jerry assured me was likely, I would still be out massive legal fees. And who was to say Susan would not just file another lawsuit after that, and another? The strategy was clear. They were going to bankrupt me or force me to give up, and the terrible part was that it might work. Over the next few weeks, I talked to friends, to other property owners who had dealt with aggressive HOAs, and to the business owners in Fairbanks who depended on the trail access. Everyone was sympathetic, but nobody had a good solution. Then I had a different idea. If they wanted to play legal games, I could too, but I would not play their game. I would play mine. I called Jerry on a Tuesday morning in July. Can they legally force me to allow access through my property? No, Jerry said immediately. It's private property. You have no obligation to let anyone cross it. Why? Just thinking through options, I said. The idea crystallized over the next few days. The HOA was suing me over the nuisance allegedly created by trail access through my property. But what if there was no trail access? What if I simply closed my property to snowmobile traffic entirely? It would hurt the local economy. It would disappoint a lot of people. But it would also completely eliminate the HOA's legal basis for their lawsuit. You cannot claim someone is creating a nuisance by allowing an activity when they are no longer allowing that activity. More importantly, it would show Susan and the Snow Peak Estates HOA that their actions had consequences. I spent a week thinking it through, talking to Jerry about the legal implications and wrestling with my conscience. The local business owners did not deserve to suffer because of the HOA's vendetta against me. The tourists who loved these trails did not deserve to lose access. The tour operators who had built their livelihoods around this resource did not deserve to see their businesses collapse. But I also did not deserve to be bankrupted by a frivolous lawsuit funded by wealthy retirees who wanted to remake Alaska in the image of suburban California. In the end, I made my decision. On August 1st, I published an open letter in the Fairbanks Daily News explaining the situation. I detailed the HOA's harassment, the multiple baseless complaints and lawsuits, and the mounting legal costs. I explained that while I loved sharing my property and supporting local tourism, I could not afford to continue doing so in the face of legal action that threatened to bankrupt me. Therefore, effective immediately, I was closing all public access to trails through my property. The closure would remain in effect for the foreseeable future. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Local business owners were panicking. Marcus from Fairbanks Arctic Tours called me within an hour of the letter being published. "Patrick, you can't do this," he said, and I could hear the desperation in his voice. "We've already got bookings for next winter. If we can't access those trails, we'll have to refund everything. It will put us out of business." "I'm sorry, Marcus, I truly am. But I can't keep fighting this lawsuit. It's going to cost me everything." "What if we help with the legal fees?" he suggested. "The business community could chip in, start a fundraiser." "I appreciate that," I said, "but this is not just about money. Even if I win this lawsuit, there will be another one and another one after that. Susan has made it clear she won't stop until the trails are closed, so I'm closing them myself on my terms." "But you're giving her exactly what she wants." "No," I said quietly. "I'm showing her what that actually means." Over the next few days, the story blew up. Local news covered it extensively. The mayor of Fairbanks gave a statement expressing concern about the economic impact. The Alaska Tourism Board issued a press release. State legislators started making noise about property rights and HOA reform. And the business owners of Fairbanks turned their anger towards Snow Peak Estates. Susan had badly miscalculated. She thought she was fighting a battle against one man who could be worn down with legal fees and bureaucratic harassment. She had not considered that this one man controlled access to a resource that generated millions of dollars in annual economic activity for the region. Tour operators started canceling contracts for the upcoming season. Hotels that normally booked solid throughout winter were looking at vacancy rates of 50% or more. Restaurants anticipated laying off staff. Equipment rental companies were facing potential bankruptcy. And all of them knew exactly who to blame. The Fairbanks Chamber of Commerce held an emergency meeting in mid-August. I was invited to attend, along with representatives from every major tourism business in the area. Susan was not invited, but she showed up anyway, along with two other HOA board members. The chamber president, a tough woman named Gloria Henderson who had owned a hotel in Fairbanks for 30 years, did not mince words. "Because of your HOA's actions, we are looking at an economic disaster," Gloria said, staring directly at Susan. "Patrick Barnes has every right to close his property, and he's doing it because you sued him. This is your fault." Susan stood up, trying to project confidence. "We have property rights too. Our residents deserve peace and quiet. Your residents chose to buy houses near recreational land," Marcus shot back. "You don't get to move to Alaska and then complain that Alaska is happening around you." "The noise is documented," Susan insisted. "We have recordings showing that snowmobiles can be heard from our properties." "Can be heard," Gloria said incredulously. "They're snowmobiles, not rocket launches, and they're miles away from your houses. Property values in our development are declining because of the noise," Susan said. "We have a duty to our homeowners to protect their investment." "Well, congratulations," Marcus said bitterly. "You protected their investment by destroying everyone else's. I hope they enjoy the silence while the town around them goes bankrupt." The meeting devolved into shouting after that. Susan and the other HOA representatives left, and the rest of us discussed options. Several business owners wanted to explore whether there was any legal recourse against the HOA, but Jerry, who had attended as my lawyer, explained that it would be difficult to prove damages when I was the one who technically closed the access. "They didn't force him to close it," Jerry explained. "They just made continuing to allow access unreasonably expensive. That's a harder case to make." "So we're just screwed?" asked a restaurant owner named Dave. "Unless Patrick changes his mind," Gloria said, looking at me. I shook my head. "I can't. Not while the lawsuit is pending. The moment I reopen access, the nuisance claim is back in play, and I'm looking at a trial that could bankrupt me." "What if the HOA dropped the lawsuit?" Gloria asked. "Then we could talk," I said. "But I don't see Susan backing down. She seems to think she's on some kind of moral crusade." I was right about that. Over the next few weeks, Susan doubled down. She gave an interview to the Fairbanks paper where she claimed that snowmobile tourism was destroying Alaska's environment, and that the economic pain was worth it to protect pristine wilderness. This argument might have resonated if it came from an environmental group or indigenous leaders. Coming from the president of a luxury housing development that had clear-cut 50 acres of forest to build mansions, it rang hollow. The Fairbanks community turned against Snow Peak Estates hard. Businesses started refusing service to residents of the development. Contractors would not take jobs there. The local grocery delivery service dropped them from their route. It was not organized or coordinated, just individual business owners making the personal decision that they did not want to serve people who were destroying their livelihoods. Susan called this discrimination and threatened more lawsuits. That just made things worse. By September, the situation had reached a breaking point. Property values in Snow Peak Estates were indeed declining, but not because of snowmobile noise. They were declining because nobody wanted to live in a community that had made itself the most hated HOA in Alaska. Several residents put their homes up for sale. The development company that had built Snow Peak had planned a second phase of construction, but put it on indefinite hold. Then the Snow Peak Estates HOA held an emergency meeting, and I got a very interesting phone call the next day. Patrick Barnes asked, an unfamiliar male voice, speaking. My name is Robert Chen. I'm a homeowner in Snow Peak Estates. I'm calling because there's been a change in our HOA leadership and we need to talk. I sat up straighter. What kind of change? Susan Carmichael has been removed as president. The board voted her out last night. Several board members resigned as well. I've been elected as the new president and I have authorization from our homeowners to resolve this situation. I'm listening, I said carefully. We want to drop the lawsuit, Robert said. We'll file the dismissal paperwork today if you're willing to meet with me and discuss this. We met the next morning at a coffee shop in Fairbanks, neutral territory. Robert turned out to be a retired engineer in his 60s, soft-spoken and reasonable. He brought two other HOA board members with him, both of whom looked exhausted. First, I want to apologize, Robert said. Susan did not represent the views of most of our community. Many of us bought in Snow Peak because we love Alaska and outdoor recreation. We didn't realize she was going to start a war with the neighbors. Appreciated, I said. But an apology doesn't solve the economic damage that's been done. I know. That's why we want to make this right. We're dropping the lawsuit today with prejudice, meaning we can't refile it. We're also issuing a public apology and making a financial contribution to help offset your legal fees. I was surprised. How much? $50,000. It's not everything you've spent, but it's what we can manage right now. The HOA is not exactly flush with cash after all the legal fees Susan racked up. And what do you want in return? I asked. There was always a catch. We want you to reopen the trail access, Robert said simply. And we want to establish a good neighbor relationship. Some of our residents would actually like to use the trails themselves. We just want reasonable noise standards and good communication. I sipped my coffee, thinking it through. Define reasonable noise standards. Nothing beyond what's already legally required. We're not trying to ban snowmobiles or restrict hours. We just want tour operators to use proper mufflers and avoid unnecessarily revving engines near residential areas. Common courtesy stuff. That's already happening, I said. The tour operators are professionals. They're not out there hot dogging. We know that now, Robert admitted. Susan was exaggerating the noise issue. Several of us have actually gone out to the trail areas with decibel meters. From our closest properties, you can barely hear anything, and only when conditions are perfect. It was never the problem she made it out to be. We talked for another hour, working through details. By the end, I felt like I was dealing with reasonable people for the first time since this whole mess started. I need to talk to the business community, I told them. They're the ones who are really hurt by this. I want to make sure they're comfortable with the resolution before I agree to anything. Of course, Robert said. Take your time. We'll file the lawsuit dismissal regardless today. Consider that a good faith gesture. True to his word, the dismissal was filed that afternoon. I called Jerry to confirm, and he verified that it was a complete dismissal with prejudice and included a settlement agreement where the HOA admitted their claims were baseless. That evening, I met with Gloria, Marcus, and several other business owners at Gloria's hotel. They dropped it, Marcus asked, incredulous. They dropped it, I confirmed. Susan's been removed as HOA president. The new leadership wants to make peace. I explained the terms of the proposed settlement, including the $50,000 contribution to my legal fees. So you're reopening the trails? Gloria asked. If you all think I should, I said. This affected you more than me. What do you think? The room was quiet for a moment. Then Marcus spoke up. I think we got what we needed. Susan's gone, the lawsuit's dropped, and they're acknowledging they were wrong. If you trust this new guy, then yeah, I think we reopen. The others nodded in agreement. All right then, I said. I'll reopen access before the snow falls. The news that the trails would reopen spread quickly, and the relief in the Fairbanks business community was palpable. Tour operators started rebooking their canceled reservations. Hotels updated their websites. Restaurants kept their full staff for the winter season. But I wanted to make sure this could not happen again. Working with Jerry, the new Snow Peak Estates HOA board, and the local business community, we established a formal easement agreement. I granted a permanent easement for recreational access through my property, with specific terms that protected both my rights and the interests of the tour operators. In exchange, the business community established a trail maintenance fund that would help me cover the costs of keeping the access routes clear and safe. More importantly, we worked with state legislators to pass a law limiting the ability of HOAs to interfere with established recreational access across private property. The law, which passed the following spring, created protections for property owners who allowed public recreational access and made it harder for HOAs to use nuisance lawsuits as a weapon. They called it the Patrick Barnes Act, which was embarrassing but also satisfying. Susan Carmichael moved back to California in October. According to Robert, several other homeowners who had supported her approach also sold and left. The Snow Peak Estates community that remained was, by all accounts, much more aligned with Alaska values and culture. That winter was one of the best snowmobile seasons in years. Tourism numbers were up, partly because the whole controversy had generated national media attention, and people wanted to see the famous trails for themselves. I guided a few tours personally that winter, something I had not done in years. It felt good to be out on the trails, showing people the wilderness I loved. One day in January, I was leading a small group when we passed near the Snow Peak Estates development. One of the tourists pointed to the houses in the distance. "That's where all the trouble was, right?" she asked. "That's the place," I confirmed. "Must have been awful," she said. I thought about that for a moment as we paused to take in the view of the Alaska Range in the distance. It had been awful, stressful, and expensive and infuriating. But it had also brought the community together, resulted in better legal protections for property rights, and removed a toxic leader who would have caused years of additional problems. "It worked out," I said simply. We rode on, the sound of our engines echoing across the pristine white landscape, free and clear. The following spring, Robert invited me to a community barbecue at Snow Peak Estates. I was hesitant at first, but decided to go. It turned out to be a genuinely nice event. I met dozens of homeowners, many of whom were outdoor enthusiasts themselves. Several had bought snowmobiles over the winter and asked about good routes for beginners. "You should come by the lodge sometime," I told them. "I'll show you some trails." "We'd love that," said a younger couple who had just moved up from Washington. "This whole thing with Susan was crazy. We bought here because we wanted the Alaska experience, not because we wanted to avoid it." As summer turned to fall and the first snows began to fall in the high country, I found myself looking forward to winter more than I had in years. The trails were in great shape, the business community was thriving, and the relationships I had built through the whole ordeal had created a stronger, more resilient local network. Marcus called me in early November with news that Fairbanks Arctic Tours had their best booking numbers in company history. "We're completely sold out through February," he said, excitement clear in his voice. "And about 30% of our bookings specifically mention the news coverage about the trail access fight. You're a marketing phenomenon." "I'm not sure that's something to be proud of," I said, laughing. "Are you kidding? This is great. And hey, we're donating an extra 10 grand to the trail maintenance fund this year as a thank you." The money was nice, But what really mattered was seeing the community come together. The fight with the HOA had been exhausting and expensive, but it had also revealed who my real neighbors were and what the community truly valued. In December, Jerry called with an update on one final piece of business. "Remember how I said it would be hard to sue the HOA for damages?" he said. "Yeah. Well, it turns out several of the business owners did file a lawsuit anyway. It's a class action against Susan Carmichael personally, claiming that she deliberately exceeded her authority as HOA president and caused economic damages through her personal vendetta. Can they win that?" I asked. "Maybe. The new HOA board is cooperating with the investigation, and they've turned over a lot of internal documents. Turns out Susan was specifically told by the HOA's lawyer that the boundary dispute and nuisance lawsuit were weak cases, but she pushed forward anyway. There's an argument that she was acting outside her authority and is personally liable." Wow. Yeah. The deposition transcripts are something else. She's still claiming she was right about everything and that the HOA removed her unfairly. She's not backing down at all. I felt a little bit of sympathy for Susan, despite everything. She had clearly believed she was doing the right thing, protecting her community and standing up for principles she valued. But she had been so convinced of her own righteousness that she had ignored everyone who tried to tell her she was wrong. And now she was facing personal financial consequences. The lawsuit against Susan dragged on through the following year. I was not directly involved, but I followed the news coverage. The business owners eventually won a partial judgment, though not for the full amount they had sought. Susan filed for bankruptcy, and from what I heard, was living with family in San Diego. I did not take any pleasure in her downfall. But I also did not feel guilty about the role I had played. I had simply stood up for my property rights and refused to be bullied into submission. That she had faced consequences for her actions was not my responsibility. By the third winter after the trail closure, the whole incident had faded into local legend. Tourists would occasionally ask about it, and I would give them the short version. But mostly, life had returned to normal, or rather, to a better version of normal. The Snow Peak Estates community had become genuinely good neighbors. Robert served 2 terms as HOA president, and then was replaced by a woman named Jennifer who was equally reasonable. Several Snow Peak residents became regular trail users and even volunteered to help with trail maintenance. The business community in Fairbanks was thriving. Marcus had expanded Fairbanks Arctic tours and added summer ATV tours using some of the same trail systems. Gloria's Hotel was rated as one of the top destinations in interior Alaska. New businesses had opened, attracted by the strong tourism economy. And the Patrick Barnes Act had been used successfully in 3 other cases around Alaska, where property owners were facing pressure from HOAs to close recreational access. The law was working exactly as intended, protecting the rights of property owners to share their land, while preventing HOAs from using legal harassment as a weapon. I still lived at the lodge, still worked as a software consultant, still loved taking my snowmobile out into the wilderness on clear winter days. But I also had a deeper appreciation for the community around me and the fragile balance of rights and responsibilities that made it all work. One evening in late March, as the winter season was winding down, I was sitting on the porch of the lodge watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. A snowmobile approached, and I recognized the rider as Robert from Snow Peak. He pulled up and cut the engine, then walked over to join me on the porch. "Beautiful evening," he said. "One of the best," I agreed. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the colors shift and change. "I wanted to thank you," Robert said finally. for giving us a chance to make things right. A lot of people in your position would have kept the trails closed just out of spite." "I thought about it," I admitted, "but that would have hurt the wrong people. The business owners, the tourists, even most of your homeowners, they didn't do anything wrong. It was just Susan." "Still," Robert said, "you had every right to leave it closed. I'm glad you didn't." "Me too," I said. Robert stood to leave, then paused. "You know, we're having another community barbecue in June. You should come and bring Jerry. We'd like to thank him too." "I'll be there," I promised. After Robert left, I sat on the porch until the stars came out, thinking about the strange journey of the past few years. I had never wanted to be in a fight with an HOA. I had never wanted to close the trails or become the center of a media storm. But when pushed, I had stood my ground and discovered reserves of strength and community support I had not known I had. The experience had taught me something important about power and how it works. Susan had believed that the HOA's legal resources and organizational structure gave her power over me. And on paper, it looked like she was right. They had more money, more people, and the ability to file lawsuit after lawsuit. But what she had not understood was that my power came from a different source. I controlled access to a resource that hundreds of people valued. When that resource was threatened, those people became my allies. The business owners, the tourists, the community members who loved the trails, they all had a stake in the outcome. Susan had been fighting one person. I had been fighting with an entire community behind me in the end that had made all the difference. As spring turned to summer and then fall, life continued its rhythm. The Trail Maintenance Fund grew healthy from contributions by grateful businesses. The state legislature continued to refine the Patrick Barnes Act based on feedback from property owners and HOAs around Alaska. And the trails themselves continued to provide joy and economic opportunity to thousands of people each year. I occasionally wondered what would have happened if I had made different choices. What if I had backed down when Susan first demanded I close the trails? What if I had tried to fight the lawsuit instead of closing access? What if I had kept the trails closed even after the lawsuit was dropped? Each alternative led to a different outcome, some better, some worse. But I had made the choices I made based on the information I had and the principles I believed in, and I could live with the results. The following winter, on a bright January day with fresh snow on the ground, I took a group of tourists from Germany on a guided tour. They were enthusiastic and full of questions about Alaska, about wildlife, about the trails. As we paused at a scenic overlook, one of them asked, "Is it true you almost lost access to these trails?" "Almost," I confirmed, "but the community came together to save them." "It must have been difficult," the tourist said. I looked out across the vast white wilderness, thought about everything that had happened, and smiled. "It was worth it," I said, and it was. Every bit of it was worth it to preserve this place, this access, this community. The trails stretched out before us, winding through the wilderness, open and free for anyone who wanted to experience the beauty of Alaska. That was what mattered. Not the fight with Susan, not the legal bills, not the stress and anger and frustration. What mattered was that the trails remained open, the community remained strong, and people could still experience the wilderness the way it was meant to be experienced. As we rode back toward the lodge that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the snow, I felt a deep sense of contentment. I had protected what mattered, stood up for what was right, and found allies in unexpected places. The HOA had tried to ban my snowmobile trails. In response, I had closed access and watched as tourism revenue collapsed and the community turned against them. But from that conflict had emerged something better, stronger legal protections, better community relationships, and a clear understanding of what we all valued. It was not the outcome anyone had planned for, but it was the outcome we got, and it was good. The trails were open. The community was thriving. And somewhere in California, Susan was learning that you cannot move to Alaska and expect Alaska to change for you. Alaska changes you, or it forces you to leave. I was glad I had stayed. This was my home, this land and these trails and this community. And I would protect it for as long as I was able, not with lawsuits or legal threats, but with the simple act of standing firm and trusting that when you do the right thing, the right people will stand with you. The snowmobile's engine hummed beneath me as we approached the lodge, the lights glowing warm in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring new groups of tourists, new questions to answer, new opportunities to share this place I loved. But tonight, I would sit by the fire, maybe call Jerry and Marcus to catch up, and rest in the knowledge that the fight was over and we had won. Not by defeating Susan or destroying the HOA, but by simply refusing to back down and showing everyone what was at stake. The trails were open. That was all that mattered. Everything else was just details.